How would you like it modified? What
Uh,
would you like done?
just so that you're a little bit more center of frame.
A little bit more center of frame. Okay, so
And
uh,
I guess because it's a phone, you can't really bring it up any higher, I guess.
yes, no, I can. I can because I can improvise. I have books and I have opposable thumbs. We can do anything.
Great, great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Jesso. I am hanging out here in the city park of Kitchener, Ontario, which is where I'm from and where I've returned to now after an adventurous travel process out west, teaching at music festivals, and I guess like spreading the good vibe. The primary talk I was giving was called Healing the Past, Healing the Future, and it was my take on inherited family trauma resolution based in my research and in my personal experiences with trauma and healing trauma in particular around altered states and, of course, psychedelic medicines, which is a primary theme here on the show and a primary area of topic. Primary topic of study in my life. I've got all of those recorded except for a couple of them, and at some point I'll likely be isolating the best performance, like the best presentation, and all the different Q&As, all the different questions and stuff, and releasing it on my Bandcamp, which I usually do with my talks at the end of the year for $0 or by donation. So everyone who didn't get a chance to come out to the events will get a chance to hear it. Although I am still waiting to see, perhaps there might be an opportunity to share that talk out here in, I guess, central eastern, slightly eastern of central Canada, in Ontario. And if so, I'll probably hold off to release it until later in the year. But either way, it's going to come out. So that's the thing. I've got a lot of really cool plans coming up for my professional life and my personal life. Some very exciting news, which also comes with a little bit of a confession in a way. But now is not the time for that, because we're going to move into today's episode. If you want to stay up to date with the new stuff that's going to be coming out, my confession, and also the announcements, two really awesome ways to do that. One of them is following me on social media in general, Facebook, Twitter, though I'm most active, I would say, I'm most active on Instagram and on Facebook. So those are the places to find me, at James W. Jesso. Another way is to follow me on my newsletter, which I typically release once a month, but I haven't released in a few months because it was very difficult to stay on top of things and to get this podcast coming out regularly and still be traveling and doing that whole thing, sleeping on couches, etc. So, I'll have a new newsletter coming up pretty soon with those announcements. So you can do that, follow my newsletter. So I got distracted because of something in my environment. You can follow my newsletter by heading to jameswjesso.com. There's a sidebar where you can sign up. Please enjoy this interview with Julian Vayne on Adventures Through the Mind. Hello, Julian. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me, James. Most appreciated. Good to see you.
So, I did not start with the bio. That was the plan. Okay, here we go. Julian Vayne is an occultist and the author of numerous books, essays, journals, and articles in both the academic and esoteric press. While his name is closely associated with chaos magic, Julian is also an initiated Wiccan, member of the, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Kaula Nath lineage. Was that right?
That'll do.
Perfect.
Yeah, close enough. That's cool.
And Master Mason. Over the past 30 years, he has participated in group ceremony with a variety of druids, shamans, and others, as well as sharing his own practice through public workshops, retreats, and networks of practitioners, including the Illuminatus of Thanateros. Is that right?
Whatever. Yeah.
Got it.
Good.
Okay. He is the leading contributor to the blog of Baphomet.com and co-director of the Psychedelic Museum, which is psychedelicmuseum.net. And the current book, the author of the current book, what's it titled?
Getting Higher, the Manual of Psychedelic Ceremony.
Fantastic. Released through Cypress UK. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me onto the show. Brilliant. Nice to speak with you.
Okay. So let's get right into something here. I haven't met very many people in my life who have made a life path and a career niched in the world of the occult. I'm curious how you got into all this.
Okay. Well, I guess the first thing to say is that I have a professional career as well. So I work in museums and heritage settings, and I work with people to help explore curiosity and how we become curious in those spaces. We get more out of our visit to a museum or a gallery or whatever. So my interest in magic is very similar to that. And the occult, which is that it's about that which is hidden. So we have various relationships we can have with stuff that's hidden. We can feel apprehensive and fearful and kind of closed in, or we can become curious and interested. And I've been curious and interested in broadly speaking, that field that I suppose we would call occultism, magic, which of course stretches from parapsychological phenomena, spirit entities, ritual ceremonial magic, the kind of stuff that you see in things like the old style late 19th century organizations like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, or the mashup of Eastern and Western mysticism that the Theosophical Society created, or the later manifestations of things like neo-paganism. So that's the field that I've always been kind of interested in, right from being a kid, when I probably should have been out riding my bike more and climbing trees. I've spent an inordinate amount of time going through tarot decks and learning all the correspondence. And it was just a thing that really, buzzed for me and really worked for me. So my interest is in that kind of field. And so the work that I do professionally, which is, as I said, to do with how do we investigate, say, a museum. A museum is literally a shrine to the muses. That's what the word means. Mm. So how do we investigate this space in a way that kind of allows us to peel back the mystery of the stuff that's in a box and get kind of beyond that into something richer and stranger and more interesting? That's one expression of that work. And my engagement with psychedelics is another expression of that fundamental interest in or the fundamental curiosity about, the mystery, the hidden, the unknown, the magical.
Cool. So your book, Getting Higher, it proposes itself as a toolbox of techniques for tripping within the intention of spirituality, self-transformation, and magic. So before we get into the interview a little bit more deeply, I'm curious if you could maybe disambiguate those terms a little bit and give us a working definition as we go through the interview when you start talking about these. So what is spirituality, self-transformation, and magic?
Okay, really interesting. I mean, I suppose like all of these words, they're all slippery, and the boundaries of them are things that aren't fixed but are continuously in play and under discussion and being made. I guess if I had to to tease those apart in this moment, what I would say is that spirituality is the human engagement with notions of the poetic, the sacred, peak experiences, how we make sense of the human condition, of the fact that we are born, that we fall in love, that we have tragedy, that we die, that we see all of those experiences of being human. How do we make sense of that in a kind of ontological, big scale kind of a way? And the progress by which we do that, one might describe as the creation of our spirituality. So I guess although there is again, we can talk about arguments of differentiation, but if we think about religion as being a series of spiritual practices which we are perhaps born into or that we become involved with, spirituality, I think, is slightly to distinguish it in this moment from the notion of religion, is that this is like an autonomous project by which we make meaning of our lives and by which we come to understand notions of the sacred. And I think that that's kind of what that one's about. When I say in the book self-transformation, what I'm pointing at there is I'm pointing at something that I think a lot of people really recognize with psychedelics, which is that they can be used to allow us to change things within ourselves. So the kind of stuff that we might describe as the set in relation to setting. So we can use psychedelics to analyze a difficulty that we have. We can use them to address a creative block. We can use them to help us solve problems. So all those kind of self-transformational things that we would probably broadly class as being kind of psychological techniques, I guess, in some respects, neurological hacks of our wetware. Depending on how groovy we want to be with our language, we can kind of go there. We can sort of think of it like that. Magic, I guess I would say that if we think about magic is those practices which are designed to affect our setting, so the apparent world in which we arise. So that can be things that we might conceptualize as, in a neo-pagan sense, spells or enchantments. They might be things that we would conceptualize as prayers in some other kind of cultural settings. So these are, if you like, instrumental ways of affecting the world. And through this idea that everything is interconnected, which is a fundamental kind of axiom of magic and is the lived experience of psychedelics, the boundary of where that connection can be magical. That is to say, it can be unknown or unguessable. So people often have experiences of things like precognition. They may have other paranormal experiences as a result of their use of psychoactives, psychedelics. And this is not to, there are maybe many ways of thinking of those things, but one way of thinking of them is through some of the language of magic, of kind of contemporary occult theory. So the book is designed to sort of say, okay, you've come across this stuff, these amazing molecules, these chemicals. You might want to kind of build this into a process which is about making meaning of the world. Yeah, you might want to make this part of the process of like changing something about yourself, or of changing something in the environment in which you find yourself. Now, all of those things have permeable boundaries. None of those things are fixed, delineated groups. But the idea of having that in the description of the book is to say, I hope that this is a text that's accessible for people who are coming to psychedelics thinking, this is kind of I need something that will help me understand the peak experiences, the kind of quasi-religious experiences I'm getting when I take this stuff. I'm also hoping that it will help people who are kind of coming to this experience and saying, these substances, and saying, well, there's something I want to change about myself, that I need healing, I need to kind of deal with a problem that I'm trying to think out and I'm finding it really difficult. Or people who are saying, well, I'm really interested in how psychedelics fit within these kind of magical worldviews of the whole of the universe being connected, and perhaps exploring what the limits of that might be. So that's the reason for dividing it in that kind of a way. But, any part of the universe you can chop up into any number of categories. So that's just how I did it in that moment.
No, that's good. I mean, on some level, all these categorizations with words are slightly arbitrary, because when we sink into the moment, and as you're describing it, there really becomes very little difference in the experiential content between what is spiritual and what is self-transformational and what is magic. But at the same time, having these models, having these linguistic platforms to sort of leverage your understanding off of can really help in better accessing, understanding where you are in a moment, especially with psychedelics, if that moment becomes too overwhelming, if you have some sort of conceptual premise to sort of put it in enough of a place that you can stabilize again, it can be really nourishing, A, from preventing harm, but also B, towards garnering something really big. And guides like the one that you're producing, or one that you have produced, I think are I think they're fairly important at this time, because there's such a rush of it's almost like, well, I mean, the psychedelic renaissance, that term feels a little played out at this point, but it really is this massive emergence of more and more people being like, oh yeah, psychedelics. The people who are already into it are stoked, but the people who weren't already into it are maybe deepening into it more and more. And having the major cultural rhetoric right now around psychedelics being the ones emerging from the academic camp is good, because it's really paving the way for their reintegration back into society. But at the same time, it's very limiting, because the academic camp isn't able to tell you, like, hey, by the way, here's how you can work with these in order to unlock different aspects of your psyche with your friends on the weekend in the woods, because that's going to jeopardize their careers, their funding, and the medicalization, legalization process. And so I think it's great that you're doing what you're doing, and having looked through your book, some of the suggestions that you have, which I want to ask you about maybe later on, are definitely fun. Some of which I applied directly into an experience I had a couple of weekends ago. So,
fantastic.
We can talk about that afterwards. What I want to pick your brain about now is, I'm curious what you see as being someone who's well educated, but also engaging with the soon to be educated public around working with psychedelics, what you feel is missing from the conventional psychedelic paradigm. So let's dial it down and then see how it expands. What do you see as being something that is missing from a so-called recreational approach, or even simply the medicalized approach? What are things that you cannot achieve with these mentalities that a more expanded engagement might open?
That's a really interesting question. I suppose I would, to some extent, I would question the assumption that there are these kind of discrete discourses about psychedelics. So, for example, in the end of this month, there's a big convention, Breaking Convention. This is the T-shirt from a couple of years ago. So Breaking Convention, big psychedelics conference, like the one that's the psychedelic science one that recently happened in the United States. And actually, if you go to places like this, what you find is something really interesting. You find a huge confluence of people who are working in everything from the sort of law enforcement side of things and challenging prohibition, through to people who are working in licensed medical research, through to people who are, let's call them traditional or native psychedelic practitioners of one form or another, and people who are kind of coming into the story from artistic perspectives or from cultural historical perspectives. So I think there's actually quite a confluence in those places and online, and certainly actually in this book as well, to bringing these strands together. I think that there are so many things there. Every single time we have somebody who has got a license to use a psychedelic in a legitimate medical research environment, that's a good thing. The more people that we get licenses, not only do we get the interesting research coming out of those pieces of experimental work, but also we create a culture in which it becomes increasingly normalized that these substances have a value and have a role to play in our culture. They shouldn't simply be excluded. I think that in going back to going right down to the sort of the core point you were saying, what are you missing out if you lock yourself into one of these discourses, medical, recreational? The answer is you're missing out in the same way that if you only eat Italian food, you're going to miss out on a whole bunch of other stuff. Yeah. So it's just as purely like that, for some people, that's the area that they're really engaged with. So I have friends who are engaged with the licensed research, for example, on MDMA and post-traumatic stress disorder. They are medics. They're medical doctors, psychiatrists. That's their thing. But none of those people are without a sense of like the artistic or the playful or whatever. I think with all human experiences, and the psychedelic experience really points towards this, which is to say that you don't just need one size that fits everyone. Yeah, you've got to have this kind of this idea of multiple perspectives and multiple views, which is what psychedelic experience fundamentally does to the way brains operate and the way that minds unfold from those brains. So to have those multiple views is really important. When I wrote Getting Higher, I wanted to put in stuff that was kind of informed by the latest psychedelic science. I wanted to put in material that was informed by both, again, traditional psychedelic practice, but also contemporary practice. And I wanted to do something which was to point out that the recreational side of psychedelics is also of value, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. Having joy, having fun. You know, people might do the peyote ritual. They might sit in a peyote ceremony because it's a religious process, it's a spiritual process, transformational process, and they really enjoy it. It's great fun. It's fantastic fun. Yes, there can be hard bits about it. Of course, there can be hard bits about it, but that's life, isn't it? That's the experience. And so part of the reason that we engage with these substances is, particularly if we're in a good place and the setting is managed quite well, the level of ecstatic delight that they can provoke is very, very powerful. And I think that feeds our souls, both individually and perhaps culturally. And so to acknowledge that, yes, we want the licensed research. Yes, we want the kind of the traditional sort of, ayahuasca type practice. And we also want to kind of recognize the fact that the notion of getting high and the joy of that, that's okay as well. And in fact, that can be part of a legitimate process of people, a legitimate spiritual process. If we live in, those of us who live in post-Protestant kind of countries, we have this sort of thing in our heads where religion is over here, religion is this sort of cold, boring, dull thing that you sort of have to do on a Sunday, and then there's all the nice kind of groovy things over here. And it's like, no. The whole point about this experience is it actually brings worlds together. It allows multiple perspectives and it brings things together. It connects those things. Mm-hmm. Does that go some way to answer that question,
Yeah,
James?
that's fantastic, Julian. Yeah, it reminds me of a conversation I had not that long ago where we're talking about why psychedelic research and psychedelics as a topic is so dynamic and interesting, because it's really about the mind and the differences. And in being that, it is like an ultimate intersectional topic, because everything is filtered through subjective experience. So everything within the discussion around psychedelics, or in the discussion around psychedelics as the psychedelic experience, any possible thing can be discussed in reference, and you can go off in any trail in any direction from it.
Completely. I mean, if you think about things like I've been working with a couple of people just sort of batting around some ideas about exploring psychedelics and queer identity, for instance, because again, psychedelics destabilize and break down boundaries. And so all of those boundaries between notions of, say, male and female and so on, or even notions of binary gender, all that kind of stuff. So you've got kind of the effects of those things there. We have the huge story of the effect of psychedelics on political culture. At a vast number of levels, everything from the whole kind of story of Nixon and Black Power and the Haight-Ashbury scene and all of that sort of stuff, through to the fact that it's kind of ironic that the licensing that's being given at the moment for MDMA research is predicated on the fact that we've sent so many of our service personnel to places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and they've come back so badly damaged that this drug, which we rejected as a culture, in terms of the state enterprise, rejected it, even though this drug basically caused people to be empathic and love one another, it was considered forbidden. And now we've managed to create so many damaged veterans, it has to come back into culture. So yeah, psychedelics become the risk of sort of a monomania about the whole thing. They are a really interesting intersection of, all human life is here. All human life is here because, as you say, it's about the mind. It's about the manifestation of the mind.
Mm-hmm. And I like what you said there about recreational use. I've also been a big proponent. I mean, earlier on in my early 20s, when I started getting into my, so-called spiritual relationship to psychedelics, I was a little bit more hardline and a bit more evangelicist about it, which, I mean, that's kind of what the early 20s are about. But more and more, I have been a real supporter of acknowledging that recreational use is on par with the value of religious ceremonial use, because as long as, I mean, to some degree, there's a discussion that needs to be had there about harm reduction and safety and not harming oneself. Sure. But assuming one is not harming oneself, where is the problem in seeking to amplify pleasure and amplify enjoyment and to bond and play and wonder with your friends?
And it's interesting that we approach that story from, well, what is the problem? So we problematize it inherently by even asking, well, what's wrong with this?
Right.
Like, give me an answer, what's wrong with this? As you know, so and that's because we come from cultures which have historically tended to reject pleasure as being something that's bad. You know, so whether that's the pleasures. I mean, if you look at the sort of the list of the 7 deadly sins, sure, there's some on there that sort of, you know, most people don't find anger pleasurable, but nevertheless, the idea of sort of gluttony, the idea that eating food, yes, eating food to excess, clearly doing anything to excess in a way that damages yourself or others is a bad thing. That's why we call it, you know, excess in that sense. But nevertheless, the idea that, you know, the root of a lot of monotheist culture is this notion that the body is wrong, sex is wrong. You know, there's this sense of that the world we inhabit is sort of sinful. And what we need to do is somehow remove ourselves from it, or at least when we do religion, with the exceptions of perhaps some of the kind of, you know, modern evangelical churches, essentially it looks like a really boring thing. You know, and it should. That's what it's meant to do. You know,
it actually it reminds me. Sorry, no, Robert. It reminds me of this Biggie Smalls. I don't know if you know Notorious B.I.G. line from one of his tracks where he goes, "When I die, fuck it, I want to go to hell. 'Cause I'm a piece of shit. It ain't hard to fucking tell. It don't make sense going to heaven with the goodies dressed in white. I want to tote guns and shoot dice."
The devil always gets the best tunes.
Yeah.
You know. And the better lines in Paradise Lost. I mean, yeah, and so to be able to kind of acknowledge that, yeah, to really sort of deeply appreciate that this idea of, and whether we dress it up by saying, oh, we're feeding our souls, or we're creating our own being, or, you know, whatever we want to do, but just say it's okay to feel good. It's okay to feel good, and there's a great example of this where you see the medical marijuana thing, where you have people saying, yes, but you just want to legalize marijuana because you like smoking it. Like that was a bad thing. Like that was, it's like, oh God, yeah, no, you're right. The fact that it's pleasurable. Yeah, if only we could invent marijuana that kind of had all its other effects but wasn't pleasurable, then it would be fine.
But you can't divorce the healing capacity of something from the pleasurable effects. I mean, like, obviously there's something really important about, you know, going through the hardships, passing through the storm and catharsis and stuff. But I think the most, and even the research is suggesting the most ultimate, the experiential content that is most correlated with a positive outcome in therapeutic sessions is basically the mystical encounter, which is an extremely pleasurable, typically an extremely pleasurable experience.
And it's also, like as you pointed out there, it's not even that we're talking about an unalloyed pleasure, because we know that with psychedelics, one of the things that happens is that the difficult stuff that we all carry with us, no matter who we are, the difficult stuff comes to the surface, and our brain, which is turned into like a massive parallel processing system, because that's basically what these chemicals do, is able to look at that problem from many, many, many different perspectives. And so the advantage of that is it means that we can see things in a new light. Maybe we can transcend things, figure things out in a better way. But the other side of it is that we see this thing revealed in all its raw difficulty from multiple perspectives. You know, we see it perhaps from the point of view of the person who we believe we have wronged. We see it from the perspective of the person who we were when we were a child and aspiring to not to do whatever the thing was. Mm-hmm. You know, so there is work there as well. There is kind of this isn't, you know, purely a kind of a free ride, as it were, and we all know that. But being able to acknowledge that there is the difficulty, the work of psychedelics and the pleasure of being high. I think that those two things don't have to be separate. They can very much go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. Piece that was coming up in what you were saying there just a minute ago, I think ties into the next question I wanted to ask. And it has to do with the culture that we're in right now, a dominator culture, really, despite its, like strong secular tendencies, it really is a direct trajectory from where we are now all the way back to essentially like Pauline Christianity and very Puritan and dissociated from true mystical encounters. Recently, a interview I had with Bruce Damer here on the show, he talked about the means by which all sort of practicing spiritual traditions were squashed by the Christian or the Catholic Church, wherein the structure of the Catholic Church basically removed any real ecstasis from all of their initiations, where originally baptismal was when they basically nearly drowned you and you had a DMT experience, and now it's just a little bit of water. And at some point the host of the Holy Eucharist or whatever was probably some sort of psychedelic mushroom. And the very foundations of Western civilization comes from the mysteries of Eleusis, until the Pauline Christians came in and smashed everything and started taking over and going through into all these like smaller, say Wiccan or whatever small cultures, completely divorcing them from their traditions or murdering them, and then giving them back their traditions in this hollow, superficial, meaningless sort of ritualistic structure that is really only a way to keep the slaves in check and keep the power, the pious power on top. So we live in a culture coming from this very Puritan place, and it dominates the world. I see you're like, go ahead.
Okay, so as speaking as a historian, that's one sort of meta narrative of history, and there is undoubtedly value and a degree of truth in that story. There are other things that one might look at as well. Mm-hmm. So Christianity, as they say, is a broad church, and there are lots of different forms of Christianity, whether we talk about contemporary liberation theology from South America, or we talk about the fifth monarchists from the English Civil War who claimed no king but King Jesus and were essentially anarchist Christians. So there's a lot of different stuff going on there if you kind of go into that sort of material. But I think the broad picture, or the broad sort of appreciation of this process of being a gradual attenuation of our connection to ecstatic revelation. Yeah, so like some guy has it, maybe a cult round him forms. And then once the output of, let's call it a psychedelic experience, is written down, then the book becomes the thing, and that becomes the mechanism by which revelation is supposed to spread, as opposed to in the Eleusinian mysteries, or in perhaps the early Christian church, or certainly in the Old Testament of the Bible, the use of things like acacia and various other plants that we can be pretty certain were used. So I agree that there is, broadly speaking, this process of attenuation. I think you can actually see many times that people, and they will always are pretty much identified as Christians, have attempted to kind of go back to what they considered to be the source. And sometimes those ideas have been very, very radical. Sometimes those ideas, because they have emerged within these bigger power structures like the Catholic was the post-Roman Empire Catholic Christian setting, they haven't prospered so well, because one of the things that does come out of those traditions very strongly is this notion of trying to keep a kind of way of thinking about the world which is consistent. Yeah, so this is about almost like a state enterprise. It's going to be really helpful if everyone thinks, broadly speaking, the same thing, and they all have their same conceptual map, and they all believe the same shit. Now, the thing about that is that as soon as you have, there was no concept of heresy in pre-Christian Rome. There were people with different views, and people would argue, and sometimes people would execute each other over their views. Mm-hmm. But the notion of orthodoxy, the notion that there is one true way to think of the world, which becomes a significant strand in many of those monotheist and particularly Christian doctrines, that seems to me to be a very disabling thing, because human beings proliferate many different views, and that's part of our delight and part of our strength. And so to try and make everyone believe the same stuff is like, that's a really bad use of the fantastic resource that is the human mind. It's understandable if you want to run a state apparatus, if you want to run a big, an empire. Yeah, you probably want to kind of put, hey guys, everyone should think this thing.
Mm-hmm.
This is the orthodoxy. This is the way things are.
Fall in line.
And so any behavior which militates against that, any behavior which is about breaking that up, is problematic and is often legislated against in very strong terms, or destroyed, or whatever. That's what happens. So I can see where Bruce is coming from on that one, and I think that there is definitely a kind of a value in that. But we're in a very different story now, very different part of the story now, for all sorts of reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that clarification. Also, I mean, admittedly, whatever knowledge Bruce has, I was a drip, a drip coming off of a glass that he offered me one day. So this does go in still to the next question, because like you said, the sort of like the main concept of just divorcing from authentic experience and this attempt to sort of herd people's minds into a certain paradigm it feels like the mandate of the Western world, what I like to refer to as the Western dominator culture. So this next question, I've got it written down because it's kind of like, it's a compound question, which many of my questions tend to be. Since you give classes and do talks on various traditions, and you're obviously someone who's quite educated on various traditions of the world, how do you feel about the loss of the magical and indigenous traditions on behalf of the Western dominator culture, what is often called the colonialization of consciousness? And where do you feel the reemergence of neo-shamanic or neo-aboriginal cultural practices? And I don't mean traditional practice, I mean specifically like the newer renditions of it, where they fall within the issue of cultural appropriation. And, compound question, how have you navigated presenting various techniques and guidance from other spiritual traditions in your own work without participating in the propagation of cultural appropriation? Wow. Boom. 3 questions, or three bits. Okay. So, James, I'll try and do this as well as I can. So if we take the first bit, so the loss of the magical and indigenous traditions that would have been part, or perhaps we might imagine were part of, what we would now describe as Western dominator culture. So we're talking about the Eleusinian mysteries. We're talking about whatever traditions there may have been about the use of, say, psilocybin mushrooms in northwestern Europe. We're talking about the exclusion to the far parts of Siberia and China and so on, the various kind of shamanic traditions, persist in Tibet and various other things. But we're talking about perhaps northwestern Europe, if we kind of focus our attention there, and then the relationship that has with the Americans rather. It's really sad, isn't it? We don't know much about the Eleusinian mysteries, and I think that's also really interesting. So we have what was quite probably, although we can't be certain, quite probably a psychedelic initiatory cult. And it was not the only one. But nevertheless, the amount of information we have about it is pitifully small, because everyone did actually shut up and not tell each other. There's those lovely kind of allegorical things about seeing the sun at midnight and the revealing of the seed of wisdom, the barley from which the magical brew, perhaps an LSD-like substance, was being prepared. We know from, for example, the work of Dr. Andy Letcher, who wrote the book Shroom, that prior to the 18th century, there's no real historical record of people using liberty caps, of using psilocybin mushrooms in, say, Britain as part of any kind of indigenous shamanic process. We can be it's probably fairly reasonable to suggest that in historic culture, those things were used.
We certainly know that there's archaeological evidence of things like in northwestern Europe, sweat lodges, for example, were used. We can be fairly certain that some of those sweat lodges involved other herbs being placed on the stones. So we have those traditions. They're half seen in the landscape. There are tiny echoes of them in the folklore associated with, say, fairies and fairy lore and so on. But they simply don't exist. I haven't got, if I'm describing myself, and I kind of, as someone who helps organize and leads ritual processes involving the psychedelic state, one of the things I might describe myself as is a shaman. Now, the only reason I use that word is because I haven't got a word. No one has given me a word. My ancestors haven't brought a word through that I can use to describe what I do. I can go for kind of contemporary reimaginings of those words as magician or witch or whatever, but I haven't got that. I'm from Britain, and I sometimes suggest that the British are one of the most oppressed people on the planet, in the sense that the power structure that has been across this island for a very long time has managed to utilize the people to become the unwitting agents of the destruction of huge amounts of the rest of the planet through the largest empire the world has ever known. We have the most heavily surveilled state pretty much in the world. We had the first parliament, which which enclosed all the land, so there was no common land any longer. So you've got a people here, my people. Of course, I'm completely disconnected from any of these traditions. They were destroyed thousands of years ago. Okay. Now, what that means, and this kind of comes on to perhaps another part of the question, the reemergence of those things. So here I am. I'm, a practitioner who's interested in magic, and I'm interested in psychedelics. I'm interested in those sorts of things. I can look around and I can see these other practices that I can learn about through books and through meeting people through other cultures. And I can also engage with those things myself. So I can use the language that is immediately apparent to me in terms of the landscape in which I live. So, for example, I might say, well, there's no tradition of people going to Neolithic long barrows and taking mushrooms in them. We don't have any evidence of this at all. But it's not impossible that that's what people did. And it's certainly something that I can do. So I can go and do that. Yeah. So I can attempt to make these kind of connections between the indigenous traditions of my land, which are utterly lost to me, and my lived experience and practice kind of now. What I can also do is that I can engage with the new spirits that our culture has met. So things like MDMA, LSD, the chemically synthesized, alchemically produced substances that my ancestors and indeed anyone else on the planet has never had access to. How can we sit with these medicines? How can we use these medicines well and in a good way? So that then takes us into this issue of cultural appropriation. And cultural appropriation is a really interesting field because culture is, again, like words, like we were talking about earlier. These are continuously in play and continuously changing. We have very often from a European or a Western perspective, we tend to, and this is arguably racist, kind of look outside of ourselves and say, well, there's our culture, which is all dynamic and changing, and then there's these cultures over here, which are basically the same and remained pretty much unchanged. And we do a bit of a noble savage thing, which is really, quite patronizing, particularly when you actually look at things like the movement, for example, of ayahuasca in South America, and you realize that a lot of the communities who are indigenous South American communities who are now using ayahuasca didn't use ayahuasca 50 years ago, because ayahuasca has moved in that culture, irrespective of anything to do with Europeans going on pilgrimage or ayahuasca tourism or anything like that. Culture is dynamic and culture always changes. So it's inherently, it's implicitly the case that if I engage with learning about, the Native American peyote circle, the peyote ceremony and the medicine that has, I can read about that stuff. I've been fortunate in as much as I've been able to go into those settings and sit, in those ceremonies and hopefully learn from those things. And I put this stuff together, and I hope that in the book, in Getting Higher, I've done several things. I hope that I've managed to represent those communities in terms of my understanding of their medicine in a way that is thoughtful and respectful, because I equally acknowledge that the power structure that I am in, the dominator culture that as you described it, the power structure that my ancestors were in, absolutely really, really damaged and hurt these people. Yeah. So I need to be sensitive. I need to be polite. Yeah. I need to be thoughtful about that. I don't need to say, but that means it's forbidden unto me necessarily, because that's not how culture is. We're a shared human culture, and culture is always moving and always changing. Someone asked me recently what, we were having a conversation. I was doing another interview, and they're asking about food, and I said, well, there are foods like the Great British Curry. Yeah, so Indian style curry is now considered, like, if you list British foods, fish and chips is one of them, curry is another. You know, equally, I have to acknowledge the fact that not that many hundreds of years ago, my ancestors were part of a power structure that was busy raping the resources and culture of India through the East India Company. Yeah. So that doesn't mean I can't eat curry, doesn't mean I can't learn how to make curry, doesn't mean I should know my history, doesn't mean I should be thoughtful about this, does mean in the case of this book that I've written that I was able to then go out to a number of practitioners, some of whom are from lineages way older than anything I could claim to be directly associated with, and put it in front of them and say, tell me what you think I've missed. Have I missed any important stuff? And of course, we made changes, we altered things. I'm going to consult with people whose wisdom I respect, and I'm going to do it in a way that's thoughtful, because I have to acknowledge my position within those things. So that's where and in Getting Higher, it does say, you know, I'm aware that my knowledge is limited, of course. You know, the book is called The Manual of Psychedelic Ceremony, and that's partly a kind of tongue-in-cheek thing, you know, hey, it's marketing. It's a manual of psychedelic ceremony. There will be many of these. There will be many of these that will come from other practitioners and other traditions and other ways of doing it. But what I've tried to do is to pull these strands together in a way that is respectful, that is accurate, and that is informed by my own practice and the practice of my other, you know, indigenous people of the British Isles who are exploring psychedelics too. Does that get partway to all three of those?
No, that's fantastic. Also, I understand that I ask these big loaded questions just to see, like, to inspire and then slightly confuse, so that it goes to like really nuanced, interesting places. And I think you addressed it very well. Thank you. So one thing that I find is important, of course, when we're looking at all these different traditions and stuff, like you said, is this like shared human culture, that there are these underlying, say, principles or underlying principles that tend to exist somewhat universally. For example, ceremony. Ceremony can look any number of different ways, but essentially ceremony is a principle. It's a somewhat universal thing, and it's also something where the essence of which has been lost to modern culture. We have some semblance of ceremonies, right? We have like coming of age ceremonies, like a Jewish bar mitzvah, or other ceremonies like Christian baptism, which is obviously, like we said, mentioned earlier, definitely not what it used to be, or wedding, which again is not what it used to be, because now it's propped up to basically be a financial grab from young couples, and then we've got these other ones, the new agey, neo-shamanic, or even so-called traditional ceremonies. But what I'm curious for you to answer is, what is a ceremony? Like, what denotes ceremony, and what does it mean, and how do we create one? And specifically, I mean answering the question from that place of principle rather than necessarily the place of aesthetic nuance.
Very interesting question, and I really value opportunities to do this kind of stuff, James, because it gives me an opportunity to reflect on those words, because we use these words all the time. So what does that mean? I suppose firstly, I would again think about the examples that you gave of ceremony and say that actually ceremony is a human given. It's a behavior that we engage in. I have 2 children, and certainly one of my children he's really interested in the idea of religion. He's created his own kind of belief system, and he has a ceremonial process that he does with that. And that's not unusual, actually. Lots of kids, lots of us engage, whether or not we've seen it in our families or not. The idea of ceremony is the idea of giving special attention to something. And actually, we do ceremony all the time. So, for example, if you have the situation where your parents perhaps are wealthy enough that they've bought you your first car. Now, if your parents do something like that, then what they might do is they might put a bow around the car or put a bow around the keys or something like this. Now, what that is that's a ceremonial process. They are paying special attention to giving you this thing. They're not simply giving you this thing. And we do this all the time. We wrap up our presents so that people can have the ceremony of opening the presents on their birthday or at Christmas or wherever. So actually that behavior is hugely common. And of course we have ceremony as it appears within religious culture, but also within civic culture, the swearing in of prime ministers or presidents or whatever, or the opening of parliaments or whatever. Those sorts of ceremonies happen all the time. I think the interesting thing is that more broadly what I'm interested in is that I'm thinking here about ceremony as bringing attention to something. And that can be very, very light touch. It can be very simple. So we might, for example, when we decide to take a psychedelic, have a ceremony which purely consists of making a prayer and saying an intention and saying thank you to the medicine before you eat it. Maybe that's it. That's all you do. It may be something that's much more elaborate. It may involve sitting together. It may involve particular types of chanting or particular symbols or images that are used within the group that are meaningful to that group of that peer group or that culture. So the ceremony itself can be highly variable, but the underlying process I think you're talking about being interested in, for me, it's about intention and attention. It's about saying, this thing that I'm giving you, I'm not just simply passing you the keys to the car. I am making a statement, both to myself, to you, to the world. I'm bringing my attention to the act of giving you these car keys because this is your first car. Yeah? From, your loving father, whoever, And that behavior is an inherent human behavior. And I think that behavior is particularly provoked by the engagement with psychedelics. So psychedelics, because they create this religiosity, this spirituality, this sense of peak experience, being able to explore the relationship between those chemicals and the set and setting that we put them in, i.e. the way we pay attention to whatever it is that's going on, that is the ceremony for me. So again, it can be very, very light touch. It can be very, very controlled and constructed. It can be something which arises almost spontaneously, or it can be something that's completely sort of pre-planned and has taken lots and lots of work to arrange. But it's really about paying attention to what's going on, and very often valuing and appreciating that. That's what we're actually doing. We're not just having a drink of wine. We're deciding that we're going to clink our glasses together and set an intention. Good health, James. Hope you're really, really well. Many happy returns, whatever. So that is a tiny micro ceremony. And I think that the fact that there's this sense that there's a bit of it missing is because we have the state enterprise ceremonies, so the things that we do in civic culture, the things that religion does. And then we have these little personal things that happen. People lay flowers where somebody has died or whatever. But the mid-range stuff, the middle stuff, the idea of coming together for a ceremony seems a bit weird. It's a bit cultish, isn't it? It's a bit strange, and that's where, but actually that's really normal. And that's why things like different neo-pagan groups have started emerging, people who are using particularly kind of psychedelics, finding ways of holding those kinds of spaces. and taking control of ceremony as well, taking control of this behavior that's an inherent human behavior, and saying, well, we can utilize this, particularly in context of psychedelics, to really create something very, very special that means something to ourselves and the other people we're doing that work with.
Mm-hmm. This, I like this because it empowers people to know that multiple things, but one of which is like every person has the capacity to build and construct meaningful practices in their lives, and it doesn't necessarily matter what it looks like as long as it has meaning. And it kind of dials into what you were saying earlier when you were sort of disambiguating magic, self-transformation, and spirituality. It's an act of magic in a way to do this thing, this, be it a choreography or a series of words or a way that you show up to something that endows something with a meaningfulness that otherwise would not be present. And I think it is really important for people to understand that. So I appreciate that you're bringing that forth, because otherwise we might end up latching on to other cultures to give us meaning. And then I think that's a lot where cultural appropriation can come in as an issue, because we just latch on to the aesthetics of something and then sort of superficially kind of implant it or inject it into what we're doing without that sense of like, is this what it means to them? You know, what does it mean to me? Does it mean it to me because it's personally meaningful, or does it mean something to me because I know it means something to another culture, so I should probably use it to make meaning here, which I think then bleeds into that concern about appropriation.
We always copy other humans to learn. That's our basic strategy, you know. And but yeah, I agree. We have to be thoughtful about that sort of stuff. So when I talk about ceremony, I am very often, when I working with people and both doing ceremony myself, sometimes with other with groups of people, and also helping people construct their own process. What I tend to emphasize is that this is about authenticity. So this is not about, you know, if you want to use a special magic word for something, if you want to call the earth, refer to the earth as Pachamama, if that works for you and you're comfortable with that and it works for the group and whatever, that's completely cool. If you want to use material from other cultures, be thoughtful about this. Be thoughtful about this, of course, given wherever it is you stand in relation to those things and those power dynamics. But really, fundamentally, what you're aiming for is authenticity. You want to speak from the heart. Whatever you're saying, you know, when somebody is involved in a ceremonial process, particularly one with psychedelics, what you're trying to do is you're actually trying to bring attention to what's going on, but you're trying for authenticity. You typically don't have huge amounts of scripting. You typically don't have rituals that are designed with large amounts of material for people, for example, to remember by rote, because that's usually not what they're for. There may be particular songs, particular prayers, particular process. But it's actually about trying to get that authenticity, which is, you know, when somebody lays flowers at the grave of someone that they love. Yeah, it's that level of authenticity. It's that level of meaning making process that we're trying to cultivate with ceremony. If that process of laying flowers at the grave of somebody is one that you feel kind of comfortable with from the point of view of kind of the cultural signifiers of that and the cultural antecedents of that, then do that and say whatever words are necessary. You know, it's about authenticity and the kind of almost the in this Taoist kind of a way. You know, what's necessary in this moment, and that's where, from what I've observed, good kind of shamanic practitioners, people who lead ceremonies, or people who are very, you know, comfortable in those environments, that's what they tend to do. They tend to be very authentic. And so although we tend to think of ceremony as this kind of stilted, formalized thing, it's not really about that. You know, in some respects, perhaps I wish there was a different word. But again, the words that my culture might have used are long lost to me in that respect.
Speaking of words that have been long lost and different practices, I want to shift into, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I want to kind of blend questions about magic and maybe magical rituals or magical practices, and our topic earlier about activities and play, and get into some of the suggestions that you put out in your book as things we can do while tripping, basically.
Okay.
So yeah. I'm not sure where the question is, but maybe I'll just repeat this. I'll say a phrase, and then you can just interpret it as a question and go off, which is like, magic are activities that we can do to implant or inject extra nuanced meaning in our experience, and during psychedelic experiences, our capacity to really experience the vast, both aesthetic and on all levels, the experiential content of meaning implied in personal or interpersonal experiences is really amplified. So I guess that's the question. That's the statement, actually. Interpret as a question. Go for it.
Yeah, man, I get where you're coming from. This is where we need that whole kind of like a linguistic chord rather than individual notes.
Right.
But I think I get where you're coming from. I mean, I like. Part of the story for me is the part of the magical tradition I became kind of connected with was this style of occultism called chaos magic, which is very much to do with technique. And so I like to give examples like, what do you mean? What's this look like? And let's take an example like you're going to go to a rave. Okay, so you're going to go to a rave. So you've got some MDMA. And you're going to go to a rave, and it's going to be like maybe you and a few of your friends. You're going to go out, you're going to have this amazing night. It's going to be brilliant. And you decide that, okay, you're going to go and have this nice time, but there's some things that you know the psychedelic experience allows you to join up bits of your neurology and to see yourself and your relationships both internally and externally from new perspectives. And so you think, right, well, I'm going to really honor the medicine. I'm going to honor the fact that I've got this beautiful substance, MDMA, and I'm going to do the following things. Firstly, when all the guys everyone comes around to your house and everyone's ready to go out, and you say, guys, look, I know it's a bit kind of strange pointy hat stuff, but would you mind very much if we were just kind of held hands for a minute? We'll put the medicine in the center in a little bowl, and we'll just send some good vibes into it. We'll say whatever is on our mind. If people want to give an intention, they want to give a blessing, brilliant. So you do that. Then everyone takes the stuff, and then you wander off to the club and you have a fantastic time and you're dancing. It's fun. It's lovely. Later on in the evening, you decide that you're going to go outside for a cigarette. So you've got some tobacco with you. Maybe you make a cigarette. Now, at that point in the evening, you might decide, well, I know that there's a sort of a neuro hack, if you want to call it that, or there's a magical practice, if you want to call it that, whereby it's very helpful, particularly in the psychedelic state, to bring our attention to things that are good. Because as human beings, we only notice our left foot if our left foot hurts.
Right.
Most of the time, our left foot doesn't hurt, so we don't notice it. So it's nice and it's valuable for all sorts of reasons to bring our attention to our left foot and the rest of us and go, thanks very much, left foot, for carrying that around all day without any complaints. You did a brilliant job. It's a very helpful thing. It has all kinds of effects on everything from your immune system to your general baseline state of kind of optimism. So you go out away from your friends for a moment, and you just go on to you sit down by the grass under a tree. You take the tobacco. You smoke the tobacco, maybe you choose to blow up to the sky, blow down to the ground, blow the tobacco around you, kind of informed by those great wisdom keepers of the tobacco medicine from the Americas. And you take that moment to pray to whatever you call it, the force, the great mystery, the great spirit, the goddess, doesn't matter. You take that opportunity to be present with all the things that are good in your life, yeah? And then you take the rest of that tobacco and you bury it under the ground. You go back to the party. You have a fantastic time with your friends. It's brilliant. And then maybe you decide that you're on the dance floor. It's really kicking in. It's 3 a.m. in the morning. You're going to use a mantra. You've kind of come up with this mantra, which for you represents this idea of transformation, the transformational possibility in your own life. You use the mantra for a bit while you're really dancing. And then, of course, it's MDMA. Your attention goes off somewhere else. You know, there's a beautiful person on the dance floor. The lights are all doing their thing. You eventually all come back to the house and you decide that Well, that was a fantastic night. That was really lovely. I tell you what, let's before we all go our separate ways, let's just hold hands for a moment. Let's really thank the medicine. Let's bless that experience. Let's take that into ourselves. Let's be fully present with it. Let's honor the medicine carriers and the medicine keepers and the people who brought this fantastic stuff with us. Everyone have a really good night. See you all tomorrow. So there's an example.
Yeah, of a series of different magical practices.
Yeah, exactly. So you can build these things in to just a night of pleasure, a night of delight. And actually, if you look at lots of ritual processes, they are similar versions. They either have more or less focus or attention depending on the substance being used or the kind of the other variables. You might decide to do one of the examples that's given in the book is quite an elaborate ritual using ketamine. And in that particular ritual, there's essentially a mummification ritual where the person, this is like an initiatory process, and it's very, very, it's a very powerful experience from the point of view of breaking out of body armor and kind of really getting down into kind of some very interesting kind of somatic body level sort of territory. But essentially what it boils down to is using what I think correct me if I'm wrong, in Canada would be referred to as saran wrap. Yeah. So cling film in the British Isles, and using this to wrap somebody up when they're naked, dosing them with ketamine, doing some magic chanting, and then at the appropriate point, carefully with bandage removal scissors, taking off the saran wrap so that they become free. Now, that's a much more elaborate and much more kind of technically complicated experience, but the basic principle is much the same. So we're taking a medicine, we're taking a substance or a series of substances, and we know how those work. And then we're creating an envelope around it, which is with either more or less moments of focused attention, not teeth gritting attention necessarily, but just awareness. Just being aware of these things and appreciating them, whether that's appreciating the fact that your left foot doesn't hurt and it's all great, whether it's appreciating the fact that MDMA allows you to have these beautiful moments of interaction, or that ketamine facilitates the opportunity to have a re-immersion experience of consciousness. So it's really appreciating those things. That's really what I hope people will get from the book. It's just, we've got this stuff. Let's use it really well, well.
Yeah, and there were some other things in there too, like those. Actually, the tobacco smoke thing I've done for many years now, and it's amazing how nourishing it truly is just to do that, and how much more the tobacco seems to ground me when I make those types of intentional actions. But there are some other things too that would look more like games and less like magical rituals. For example, you have one of the suggestions as things to do while tripping is to make art. Obviously that seems pretty obvious, but it came up actually during a recent ALD 52 experience with some friends of mine, and we were out in the woods, and we had taken inspiration from your book, and we had made a list of games to play if at any point we were like, all of a sudden like, hey, pull something up, let's play this game. One game that we played, which you didn't mention, was to find a thing. And then try to make the face we see in that thing at each other. And then another one was based on your concept of the museum dose, which is just enough of a particular psychedelic to go wander around a museum. But we kind of flipped it and did the where everything our entire experience was a museum. So wherever we were, it was like, oh, hey, look at that, like, and talking pseudo intelligently about it. Then making art. We were out in the woods, and all of a sudden there was just like, we found this collection of seashells, and we spent about 25 minutes collectively just putting things in places until all of a sudden, we had basically a shrine to the great Yoni at the end of it, but we had been building art. What are some of the other sort of activities or games that can have this deeply personal, spiritual, self-transformational, magical quality, but are playful?
Okay, I mean, those are lovely examples. And in the book, I've given a sort of a scattering of examples because you're right. Any behavior, any interesting, creative, open-ended behavior, any playful behavior can have huge value on psychedelics because, again, they join up bits of the mind that were previously or typically tend to be kind of discrete or less well connected. When we play, we're not trying to create an outcome necessarily. That's one of the things about it. So a really good example of that is if you have like modeling clay, Play-Doh, it's called over in Britain. I don't know if it's the same name it goes by, but salt dough. If you give somebody some salt dough, no matter what age they are, what culture they come from, they need no instructions. You don't have to say, oh, and by the way, you can make stuff out of it, because that's what a human does.
Right. You
know, a human will just do this. And so any of those behaviors, particularly ones where we don't necessarily have to have an outcome. So you ended up arranging the seashells and then discovered that this was a shrine to the great yoni. This could have been a shrine to any number of different things, but obviously it's seashells. You know, you're doing this, you may be making a particular shape, whatever. It makes sense. So you end up interpreting what's going on, and psychedelics allow us to have these great levels of interpretation. But the important thing about play is that we're not necessarily trying to produce something. We're not necessarily trying to produce best art, you know, whether that's music or whether or not that's visual art or whatever, to the finest caliber. We're just playing with those things. We're exploring those things. There's no insistence on an output. In terms of those behaviors, though, anything is possible. I mean, I personally think that playing with natural materials is really interesting. So going into a beautiful location and playing with the stuff that's there. And that could be anything from seeing, you know, looking at finding fallen leaves and testing how the light passes through them when you look up at the sky. You know, oh, this one's all got a fine filigree of, you know, and then dividing those maybe into different categories or whatever, or arranging them in some way. It's getting to this thing about psychedelic experience allows us to reconnect with our minds as they were when we were younger. Very often, there are, although there are distinctions, there are many similarities between the kind of processing that goes on in a pre-adolescent brain and the way that psychedelics operate on adults. And so another example would be which has a more kind of magical style to it, if you like, is to do something which in psychology is called a sculpt. So you have various objects that maybe you assemble in a room, which are objects which represent something. They, one might represent you. One might represent the person that you are, someone who's your lover. One might represent another member of your family. One might represent a difficulty that you have. And so you arrange these things on a table, let's say. You know, they could be anything, you know, random objects, spoons, buttons, you know, fruit. And then by moving these things, by moving the relationship of these things, there is a corresponding reflection, if you like, in terms of your own psychological. We'll just treat it as psychological. We won't go for anything kind of woo, magic-y stuff, really. But just purely psychologically, you're externalizing. So again, it's ceremony. You're being attentive and thoughtful about a set of objects that represent an internal process. So this could start off just as a game. You might just kind of like be, you can sort of almost jokingly play an imaginary chess with a friend. So let's imagine you're in your room, and so I move one object and I say, check. You know, and there's no, I'm just making it up. I'm just pretending. We're faking having a chess game. But nevertheless, as we do that, maybe we discover that there is a meaning in what we're doing. Because psychedelics allow us to find meaning, even in things that are basically fairly meaningless. But the process of finding meaning is how meaning is made. And so that's what, you know, so all of that play, all of that open-ended stuff allows us to kind of go, well, I'm just, you know, throwing water in the air at the moment. That's all I'm doing. I'm just getting water. I'm throwing it in the air and looking at how it looks. Now I notice that on the floor, the way the water has fallen, it reminds me of whatever it reminds me.
Right, yeah.
So the completely free process then becomes one that you start to go, oh, yeah, hey guys, this is a shrine to the great yoni. Check it out. And you'll go, yeah, it is. And you get that realization, you know. And so play is fantastic for that, because also it allows us to listen to what the medicine is telling us. Because very often in our culture, we have this thing about the instrumentalization of things. You know, we're going to do this thing for this purpose. And even with psychedelics, you know, I'm going to take MDMA, not because it's fun, but because I've got post-traumatic stress disorder and I'm a veteran. Understandably so, because I've had a horrible time. But actually, rather than being instrumental with these medicines, I'm going to use it to do this thing. Very often it's useful to say, I'm going to take this medicine and I'm going to engage in playful activity because it will teach me something. Mm-hmm. Yeah? It will teach me something which I probably won't notice until the end of the trip, where we're all sat just around the campfire, and we go, do you know where we put the shrine to the great yoni? Do you know it's in the West? So it must be like blah, blah, blah. And you find these connections. Yeah. So the playfulness allows us to have a chance to listen to the medicine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Yeah. I'm totally on board with you. And I also want to add, and I'm sure it's totally in there, that playfulness has the same result to some degree, a little bit less, in the rest of our lives too. And we as adults, play. I mean, I play a little bit more, but I'm very attentive to being out and play. But it seems like in order to play, I have to go so far as to like bring on board some sort of powerful hallucinogen to give me permission to just have a whole day of doing nothing but whatever the hell I want in a fun and exciting manner.
It's an important thing to do. It's important sometimes to be diligently indolent. Right on.
It's a really brilliant moment for you to just like freeze up.
To just sit around and not do anything.
Like total audio glitch there in just a second. I'll take that as a moment. I'll take that as a moment to shift over into the last question here before we find resolution. And it's actually, this podcast is funded on Patreon, and at a certain degree, patrons get included in this discussion group and they get to know who is coming up on the show and ask questions if they're particularly interested. So this is actually a question from one of my patrons named Alan. Here we go. It says, where, if at all, do you see an overlap between the practice of magic and the practice of depth psychology and Jungian shadow work? What are the differences? And then in parentheses, he says, I don't know very much about magic, but seems like there are similarities.
It's a very interesting question, Alan. I mean, I'm by no means well-versed in Jungian psychoanalysis, so I think I understand what he's referring to in terms of kind of shadow work. I'm familiar with the notion of archetypes and the shadow as being one of those. I suppose there's a relationship in as much as going back to something we spoke about right at the beginning of the interview, which is that if we have the shadow, if we have the other, and very often the excluded, the dark, the thing that's intimately interlinked with us, but is nevertheless different in some way from our conscious apprehension of ourselves, there are various ways that we can engage with that. So we can be frightened of it. And we can say, oh, the shadow, oh, that's a scary thing. I'm going to avoid that. And of course, as I'm sure that Jung and many other people have pointed out, frankly, that doesn't even work. So it's not even a very good strategy.
Yeah.
So one of the questions can be, well, if the shadow is the occult, the mystery, the night, the dark, can we approach that in a way that is curious, that is circumspect and sensible, but is nevertheless about curiosity? Can we be curious of what is in the shadow? Can we be curious about what is in the dark? And can we use that curiosity to find a way of connecting with or acknowledging this material in a way that is perhaps less traumatic than it might otherwise be, or at least it becomes more whole as we go through that process for both ourselves and others? I think that the same, I guess, is true of psychedelics generally. I mean, we can think about, these are terrifying things. Terence McKenna famously used to sort of talk about the ontological terror that taking psychedelics would provoke in him. I have slightly different views on some of that sort of stuff, which is that I think that, for example, using a psychedelic in a museum, you don't want a hugely overwhelming dose. The whole point about it is that you want to be able to be in both worlds at the same time. And I think that there's value in everything from microdosing to abstinence to whatever. But fundamentally, we can see psychedelics as a frightening thing. This is a scary narcotic that can drive you mad, right? That's a completely unreasonable view, but it's a view that many people do still maintain. Or we can say this is a powerful thing, this is like the shadow, and it has potential within it which can allow us to understand ourselves and our position within culture and our relationships with others and the human condition in a really, really powerful and good way. If we can engage with them with a little circumspect kind of sensitivity and with curiosity. So I think that there's kind of an overlap in that sort of sense with regard to psychedelics. And in terms of magic, yes, magic is the technique of is the process of using the imagination. That's one of the things that I think of magic as being. And it's using the imagination to, and this is a quote from a magician called Phil Hine, to extend the limits of our achievable reality. And we know that, for example, with Carl Jung, he used the imagination to do exactly that sort of work for both himself and also the people that he was working with as patients in analysis. And very often he would do that by really engaging with the imaginal content of those people. So when a patient of his said, you know, I had this journey and I went to the moon and it was like this, blah, 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 Jung wouldn't then say, well, yes, but you only imagined that you went to the moon. Because to imagine that you go to the moon and to go to the moon in a psychological sense is functionally identical. It's the same thing. In the same way that when Jung used to go back to his house, he had this sort of, you know, fantastic sort of castellated building that he would dwell in sometimes. And when he would return to what he thought of his kind of archetypal house, he would always greet all the pots and pans. Now, he wasn't doing this for an effect. It's because he was appreciating that from an imaginal perspective, these are beings, you know, and I want to relate to those beings through the technique that I have as a human, which is to say hello. Hi, pots and pans. I haven't seen you for a long time. It's really nice to be here. I'm sorry if I've neglected you. So engaging with that imaginal world is what magic does. Magic does that sort of stuff all the time. It engages with notions of spirits, deities, imaginal entities, inner world journeys, shamanic visions, all of that sort of stuff. The techniques of the imagination, which Jung rediscovered as an extension of the work that Freud was doing in the domain of psychoanalysis, are very, very, very similar. And that's why, you know, if they don't know about anybody else, then most magicians and most sort of occultists will at least be hip to Carl Jung, because he was, very much part of the modern iteration of those traditions. So yeah, massive overlap, identity in many places.
Julian, thank you so much for providing your wisdom and perspective on all of these questions for today, and for the very fun and engaging conversation.
James, you really, really welcome. Thank you very much for those really interesting questions from you and from Alan. And I really hope that, you know, people kind of engage with your work, engage with the stuff that I'm doing, and get something really useful and valuable out of that, and that we can build what is actually, you know, you use the term psychedelic renaissance. Let's build that community of the Renaissance. You know, we're doing that now, and there's a lot of interesting stuff happening. So thank you very much for inviting me onto the podcast. Really, really appreciate it.
Cheers. Before we cut the recording on this one, can you please let the listeners know where they can get a copy of your book, Getting Higher, and where they could just get a little bit more involved with what you're doing in the world?
So this thing, hey, there it is. Getting Higher, you can get this from Psychedelic Press. So Psychedelic Press UK, you'll find them online. I'm just checking out. It's psychedelicpress.co.uk. Then I maintain a blog with various other people, which is the blog of Baphomet. That's Baphomet is with a PH, Baphomet.com. There's lots of writing there about a lot of kind of esoteric stuff, but also psychedelic stuff, queer culture stuff, all kinds of material. And Then I'm also involved in this project, the Psychedelic Museum, psychedelicmuseum.net. So we have a pop-up exhibition happening at the big Psychedelics Conference Break and Convention in the University of Greenwich later on this month in June. And it's easy to get hold of me. I'm on Facebook and stuff as well, so people can catch me there.
Great. Well, I will make sure the links to all of that are included on the show notes, which for the listeners, of course, are always at jameswjesso.com. And I look forward to maybe meeting you in person one day, Julian. I went to my first UK experience last year, and I feel like it wasn't the last one. So let's keep in touch.
Cool, man. Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. Nice one, James. Thank you very, very much.
Take care. Bye.
Cheers.
All right. Thank you for listening to this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Please take a look at Julian's book, Getting Higher, the Manual of Psychedelic Ceremony. You can find a link to where you can purchase that book on jameswjesso.com for episode 55 here of the podcast. If you liked this show, which I assume you must if you're this far into the episode, you've made it all the way to the end, then please consider heading to jameswjesso.com/support to support the show. There is a variety of ways that you can do that. The most direct is the financial support, which you could do through a one-time PayPal donation or by becoming my patron on Patreon. Let me assure you that this podcast, this is like my thing. Like, this is what I'm giving. It's a part of my life's work. And I am working very, very hard to make this content so positively beneficial to you and your life and the lives of others that it can, as a I don't know if karma is the right word or reciprocity, but that my hard work towards building this podcast and the rest of my things, speaking and writing, which is my heart and soul, that it will translate into an active community of voluntary supporters, patrons that help me live a economically sustainable life, investing further into things like this show, into my education, and into my written work. And Patreon and PayPal is a way that happens, and it is a way that you can help this whole podcast and my writing grow and continue to positively influence the world in the ways that it's benefited you. So please consider going to jameswjesso.com/support to take a look at those options. You could also follow me on social media at JamesWJesso everywhere. All right, take care.